Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our special Monday session. I'm glad to see many of us are here tonight. I know we said attendance is not necessary, and so if some folks need to leave early, if you have other work obligations, things such as that, that is certainly understandable. But it is, as I told you a couple weeks ago or last week, whenever it was, that it's important that we have the two sessions this week just so we can keep on schedule and try and get everyone all graduated and finished with everything by the end of fall 2025. So thank you again for being here tonight. The Canvas essays, the first one, I've gone through all those that have been submitted up to this point in time. And I didn't give you a whole lot of feedback because all you were doing is you're just introducing the organization that you're using for your organizational analysis paper. So the feedback you got was probably something along the lines of this will work well for the paper, work well for the class. I think that all the organizations will work well. The only thing is, again, if you're using a large organization, I don't think anyone's using that large of an organization, but if anyone's using a large organization, you might want to break it down into unit, division, or department to make it a little bit easier to manage for the paper. But I think for all the organizations everyone mentioned, they should work very well. Most of them are cities. There are some nonprofits, and so it'll be interesting to kind of see the similarities and the differences as those papers come in terms of your organizational analysis. Now, in terms of your second Canvas essay, that is due next week. And for that second, next week on next Monday, I believe it is. So on that Canvas essay, what you'll be doing is selecting a public or nonprofit organization, and then comparing that to a private sector organization. Two similarities and two differences. But what I would like for you to do in this essay, as you talk about those similarities and those differences, really hone in on those differences between public and private organization examples and what those differences mean for how we would go about studying those organizations. And so drawing upon some of the information that we talked about last week. So, a lot of possible topics there for you. So, one major difference we oftentimes see is a difference in terms of unionization. So if you have a highly unionized workforce in the public organization, obviously, as we study that public organization, as we study the interaction between leaders and employees, we're going to have to take into account not just the career civil service regulations, but also allow those stipulations in the collective bargaining agreement that we may not have to take into consideration in the private organization. Sunshine, the amount of scrutiny that's provided to those public organizations compared to those private organizations can have an impact upon behavior. So as we study the behavior of people within those organizations, we have to take into account just how much public scrutiny there is, and so on and so on. So it'll be interesting to see the organizations you compare, and then what do the differences really do mean for how we would go about studying those organizations? Because after all, that's what this course is all about. Studying organizations and applying relevant theories to understand the behaviors and the practices and the structures of those organizations. So that's Canvas essay number 2. And as always, your initial response and then responses to 2 of your classmates. So just basically do what you did week 1, the same type of approach in week 2, and everyone will do just fine. So what we are planning on doing tonight is to jump into our discussion of the chronological development of organization theory, beginning with classic organization theory. And we spent a week on this back in the PPA 500 course, talking about organization theory. And I believe we spent probably about 20 or 30 minutes talking about the school of classic organization theory. Here, we're going to spend an entire evening looking at the school of classic organization theory. So some of these authors you've read before, we've talked about before. We're going to put a little bit more flesh on the bones as we talk about these different theories and these authors. So here in classic organization theory, where we typically always start is we always start with our good friend Max Weber. And as we know from our discussion of Max Weber back in 500, Max Weber comes at the study of organizations from outside of the discipline of public administration. So Max Weber had a degree in sociology. He also did a lot of work in political economy, but not necessarily working directly looking at public sector organizations. So this is a good example of drawing upon theorists and theories from outside of our field then making some modification and tweaks to those theories to make them apply to the specific realities of working in the public sector. So as you probably remember, Max Weber was very much a believer in rationality. Max Weber was a very big believer that we should make our decisions based upon empirical evidence. And as you know, empirical evidence means evidence that we can collect, evidence that is tangible in nature, evidence that we can actually sense and that we can actually analyze. So instead of just making our decisions based upon what we believe, we're going to make our decisions based upon empiricism. He was a big believer in laws. He was a big believer in documentation. So once we collect that empirical evidence, we document that empirical evidence so that future generations in our organization can also rely upon that empirical evidence for making their decisions in the future. Now, we know that there are disadvantages as well as advantages of relying upon written documentation. The primary advantage of relying upon written documentation is that you can treat people in a very equal manner. That if you have these rules and these regulations and you adhere to them, then you will be able to make sure that you are protecting the individual rights of individuals you are dealing with in your organization. We know that the protection of individual rights is one of the primary values that underpins the entire discipline and study of public administration. We know that there are some disadvantages, though. One major disadvantage is the whole idea of red tape. Once you develop all this written documentation and these rules and regulations to rely upon, you develop too many, and then you have all this red tape that you have to sort through. We also know that creating a lot of this written documentation, these rules and regulations, can also lead to what's referred to as goal displacement. And that's something we'll talk about in a couple of weeks when we talk about Robert Merton and structural functional theory. That when organizations have too many rules, the adherence to those rules then becomes the primary goal of that organization, as opposed to serving citizens. So your real goal of serving citizens becomes supplanted by the goal of adhering to your rules and your regulations. That is the primary dysfunction of a large bureaucratic organization. So Weber certainly has his advantages as well as his disadvantages. But he really placed a very high value on the ability of bureaucratic organizations to make decisions. He really felt that bureaucracies were the highest level of rationalization. So Max Weber based a lot of his theories on the idea of the source of authority. So organizations derive authority from a variety of different sources. He identifies three different primary sources of authority. He identifies what's referred to as a charismatic authority, traditional authority, and the legal rational authority basis. So I think we are all familiar with charismatic authority basis. We've all worked with charismatic leaders before. We know that in charismatic basis of authority, the authority essentially resides within the person themselves, within the leader themselves. So the leader leads through their characteristics. And I think we probably made mention of this in our 500 class, but there are a couple of different theories of charismatic leadership. One theory of charismatic leadership is the attributional theory. And in that theory, people will follow someone who demonstrates leadership skills that they attribute to effective leadership. So if there's someone who looks like a strong leader, someone who is able to engender a lot of support among followers, someone who is very decisive and makes decisions very quickly and very decisively, those are all characteristics that we attribute to strong leadership. And so if someone demonstrates those characteristics, that's the type of person who has the charisma that we would then follow as a leader. The second type of charismatic leadership is what's called self-concept theory. And in self-concept theory, people will follow a leader who they associate themselves with, someone who reminds them of themselves, someone who seems to share the same values and the same norms and the same beliefs that they share. And those are the types of people that we follow, people who we really kind of associate with ourselves. But the problem with charismatic leadership is that the basis of authority resides within that one individual. So obviously, if it's residing within that one individual, it's residing in that person as opposed to residing in the formal organization. So the power is in the person as opposed to being in the position, which makes it a very transient, a very temporary type of authority-based relationship. The second basis of authority, according to Weber, is the traditional basis of authority. So the traditional basis of authority is basically the status quo. So we follow this person. This person has authority because they have always had authority. And so something like the divine right of kings, hundreds of years ago, that we had a royal family and it was always a leader came from that royal family. Kings beget kings because of that divine right of kings type of traditional approach. And then the third basis of authority that he really believed in is the legal, rational basis of authority. The authority does not come from the person. Authority doesn't come necessarily from tradition, but rather authority comes from the rules and the regulations and the laws that govern the organization. So the authority really is something that is rooted in the organization and rooted in the formal positions within the organization. So when you are basing your authority on the legal, rational type of basis, you have much more of a permanency to that type of authority. And that even if the leader leaves the organization, the power doesn't necessarily go with them. The power remains within the organization. So here's a big believer on number 3, the legal, rational basis for authority. But let's drill down a little bit more into those different bases of authority, because each one of those bases of authority will then result in administrative systems. So with the charismatic basis for authority, that charismatic basis of authority will then create a charismatic administration system. The charismatic administration system, administration really revolves around that individual charismatic type of leader. And as we said, the downside of that is it's an inherently unstable type of administrative system because people come and go, leaders come and go all the time. I've been here at Cal State Long Beach for 24 years, and in my 24 years, I've gone through, I believe, 7 different deans, either permanent deans or interim deans. So you've got a lot of turnover in that type of leadership. So as the person goes, they take with them their charisma, they take with them their basis for power. So it's an inherently unstable type of leadership. The nice thing about a charismatic administration system is that it really does create a very loyal following. So if people are following a charismatic leader, either based upon attribution theory or based upon self-concept theory, they tend to be very loyal followers. And so it provides a lot of political capital to that leader in that charismatic administrative type of system. The traditional basis of authority will create administrative systems such as the patriarchal administrative system, the patrimonial administrative system, and the feudal administrative system. So in a patriarchal administrative system, the leader in that administrative system typically leads with a lot of reliance upon internal governance. And so the power resides within that person where the power has always resided and the very close family members of that individual. So it's a very internalized governance type of system in a patriarchal administrative system. In a patrimonial administrative system, you start to see the governance extend beyond just that individual leader and the close family members of that individual leader. And now you start to see the administration be kind of handed over a little bit to the close friends and the very close longtime allies of that individual leader. Then you have the feudal administrative leader, and that's administrative system, and that's very much like a feudal system of governance, where external governance is being conducted by political allies of the leader. So they're not necessarily close family members, they're not even necessarily close friends of the leader, but rather the leader enters into a transactional relationship with these political allies, takes individuals that are external to the family and makes them into political allies through these transactional types of relationships. So I will provide land to you, and I will make you a nobleman and provide you with this land as long as you support me and you defend me, you go to war for me, raise armies for me. That's our transactional relationship that we would see in that type of a feudal type of system. But a patriarchal, patrimonial, and feudal administrative system all flow out of this traditional basis of authority. Those are the bases of authority. Those are the administrative systems because they have always been the administrative systems. It's very much inertia. It's very much that type of status quo. Weber certainly rejects that type of administrative system, and the one that he favors is the bureaucratic administrative system. Again, growing out of the legal rational authority basis, where administration is conducted by technical administrators, administrators who have the knowledge and the skills and the abilities to be able to do those types of jobs. So the power is very much of a technocratic type of power, that it's these bureaucrats, these civil servants, and our civil service system for many years, since 1883 in the Pendleton Act, has always been kind of an example of this idea of bureaucratic administration. Now, in our current administration, with the advent of a lot of these rifts of federal employees, a lot of the administration's challenges to the career civil service system, the presentation of essentially loyalty oath to federal employees, that may kind of transition us a little bit away from a bureaucratic administrative system and more toward a traditional type of system, whether it be patrimonial or feudal in nature. So this may be changing in the future years. A lot of it depends upon what the courts say, because we have literally dozens upon dozens of court cases. And so we'll just kind of have to wait with bated breath to see what the courts do in that type of situation. But for the most part, our career civil service system that we are very familiar with here in public administration is really predicated on Weber's bureaucratic administration type of system. So Weber says what we need to do is we need to make these decisions based upon empirical evidence, and we need to empower these technical bureaucrats with the ability to make these types of decisions based upon the evidence and the written rules and regulations they have collected and they have created. That means Weber says we need to have a very regimented structure to our bureaucratic organization. And as we've talked about before, this led Weber to his conceptualization of the ideal bureaucracy. That if we could create an organization that aligned with these different characteristics of the ideal bureaucracy, that's how we could create effectiveness and efficiency. Now, make no mistake about it, Weber's primary goals that he was focusing on is to come up with a way to make these bureaucracies, these organizations, as effective and efficient as possible. And for Weber, the definition of effectiveness was a definition along the lines of the goal attainment model of effectiveness. That if the organization is achieving its goals that it's created, that were created by these technocrats, then the organization is being effective. So it is very much this panacea, is this one-size-fits-all approach that he wanted to see all of our organizations fit into this polemic known as an ideal bureaucracy. So that ideal bureaucracy, as again, just as a recap from what we learned about a year ago, the ideal bureaucracy was made up of several component elements. The first element of an ideal bureaucracy is obviously a division of labor. There are a lot of jobs, a lot of tasks that need to get done on a daily basis in an organization. In order to effectively and efficiently do those jobs, we need to divide the labor up. And most of our organizations today engage in a very pronounced division of labor. We all have our individual tasks that we do. As a faculty member, you teach certain types of classes on certain types of days at certain types of times. You do certain types of research in certain fields. You serve on certain types of committees. That's a division of labor. Congress is another great example, even though it's not a bureaucratic institution for the most part, it is a great example of division of labor. Like Woodrow Wilson used to tell us, Congress at work is Congress in committees. Whenever Congress gets things done, which it doesn't do a whole lot over the past few decades, but when it does get something done, it typically gets it done through the committee structure. We have committees, we have subcommittees. Those subcommittees focus on certain types of tasks. Then they report their findings up to the parent committee. The parent committee will then pass out their bills after markups, will then go to the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate, and so on and so on. But the real quote unquote sausage making of making legislation and policy happens within those committees, division of labor. When we divide up the labor among all the people within our organizations, those individuals then specialize in certain types of tasks. The specialization in tasks is important because when you are specializing in the same tasks day in and day out, obviously you become an expert in those jobs that you are doing. So if you are a budget analyst, you are specializing in the task of analyzing budgets. So you will know more about the budget than probably anyone else within the organization. If you are a reclassification uh, manager and you do reclassification for employees, a reclassification analyst, I say, and you do reclassification of positions, you are going to become an expert in the reclassification of positions. If you're a program manager for a specific program, you're specializing in that specific program, you become an expert. So specialization of task will lead to expert status on the part of these bureaucrats who are working the organization. Ideal bureaucracies also have a span of control, unity of command, and a tall hierarchy. Tall hierarchy we're all familiar with is that pyramidal shape. You have one leader at the top. As you move down your organization chart, you then encounter more and more positions where the plurality of the positions in your organization are probably going to be located at the bottom of the organization chart in very much that triangular pyramidal type of shape. Tall hierarchy. The tall hierarchy then exhibits a unity of command, meaning that everyone has someone to whom they are accountable. So you know who your supervisor is, your supervisor knows who their supervisor is, and so on up the organizational chain. Each of those individuals in the organization chart then has a limited span of control in that they will only be responsible for a limited number of employees. So you might be responsible for 3 or 5 or 7 or maybe 12 employees. That is your span of control. So you will not necessarily be responsible for every single person located below you in the organization chart. If you're a department chair, you are accountable and responsible for the staff and the faculty within your department. If you are as an associate dean, then you are responsible for the actions of the departments in the college, and so on and so on. So everyone has a limited span of control within this unity of command in this tall hierarchical system. We know that Max Weber really believed very much in rules and regulations. So our organizations in ideal bureaucracy are rule bound. Actions are bound by the adherence to these rules and these regulations. And those rules and regulations are developed out of the collection and studying of this empirical information. The technocrats, the administrators in our organization, are professional administrators. They are professionals in that they have the requisite skills for doing the job, and they also are relatively permanent in the position. They are career administrators as well, in that Weber didn't envision employees being kind of the free agents that they are today. I think I read recently that the typical employee today will go through 3 different occupations in their lifetime and multiple different organizations. I've been a full-time faculty member at 3 different organizations over my 29 years, even though I've been at Long Beach for 24 of those 29 years. So people do tend to move between organizations. He viewed people as being within organizations for an entire career. This is kind of an example in modern theories of Ouichi, O-U-C-H-I. And if you've read any of William Ouichi, you know that Ouichi's approach, the kind of the Japanese management model, is that people really buy into their organizations as a family. And so therefore they work there for their entire careers. And that's what Weber thought people should do. And then, of course, everything gets written down. So whatever behaviors we exhibit, whatever actions we engage in, whatever rules and regulations we write, all of that should then be memorialized in writing so that future generations of the organization can rely upon that type of written documentation. So those are the primary characteristics in Weber's ideal bureaucracy. And he felt if we could create organizations that adhere to those ideal bureaucratic characteristics, that's how we make our organizations as efficient and effective as possible. It is very much that one size fits all type of an approach. The nice thing about a one size fits all approach is that it makes organization theory very simple. Well, here are the things that organizations need to exhibit. So we study the organization and make sure the organization exhibits all of those characteristics. So it's a very simplistic way of studying organizations. And there are a lot of problems with it we'll talk about in a second, but that's what makes it very easy. It's very easy, very simple to study organizations. Now, in terms of Max Weber's idealized bureaucracy and what it means for our 4 models of organizational effectiveness, Weber's ideal bureaucracy would really favor very much the rational goal model. So that's the first model that is emphasized with ideal bureaucracy. It's clearly a rational goal model because the ultimate goal of the organization is to achieve effectiveness. And effectiveness is measured, not to make this too tautological, but the effectiveness is then measured by the achievement of the goals. So goals are very important. So organizations that are structured like this will engage in a lot of planning. They will establish goals and then they will monitor their achievement of those goals and then keep written documentation about how well they are achieving those goals. As we know with our Quinn and Rohrbach matrix that we had talked about in a previous class, I guess it was last week, the rational goal model of organizational effectiveness falls in the bottom right of that matrix, meaning that it is very control-oriented and it does have somewhat of an external focus. Because oftentimes the goals that we are establishing as an organization are goals that are placed upon us by our external environment. So we do not also always have carte blanche to create our own goals as organizations. We have to create goals that are in alignment with the goals of our external environment. So there is kind of that external focus, but it is very much oriented around control. This tall hierarchical system is predicated upon top-down control, predicated upon a lot of micromanagement and micro direction from the top down to lower levels of the organization. The focus is on the structure of the organization. And since we're looking at the structure of the organization, then there's also an emphasis placed upon the internal processes of the organization as well. So there's also a very internally focused approach to ideal bureaucracy. And still a lot of that top-down type of control mechanisms also involved. So 2 models of organizational effectiveness: goal attainment model, the rational goal model, and the internal process model. In terms of the Mintzberg's mechanisms for coordination and control, those are again going to be very much top-down in nature. And so here we're looking at mechanisms for control such as direct supervision. So a lot of direct supervision, a lot of micromanagement of employees by managers and by leaders. Some standardization as well, standardization of worker skills. In terms of standardization of values, not quite so much because there's not really that much concern about bringing the values in alignment between the organization and the employee. Because if the employee does not share the values and the goals of the organization, in a Weberian model, we would just remove that employee. That employee would just be fired and will be replaced by someone who would then be in compliance and adhere to those values and those goals of the organization. In terms of how we get people's compliance, how we motivate them, it's all about legal compliance. We hold them accountable to abiding by these rules and the regulations. If they do not abide by the rules and the regulations, then obviously there will be punitive measures to make sure that in the future they will abide by these rules and these regulations. If they are making a habit of not abiding by rules and regulations, then once again, they're replaceable parts and they can just be removed from the organization and replaced with someone who will adhere to those rules and regulations. So it is a very stringent, very strict, very top-down, classical approach to how we structure our organizations. We know that there are a lot of limitations that were associated with Weber. Every time we have a new school of thought that emerges, it usually emerges as a response to the criticisms against the previous school of thought. And so the reason why we have neoclassical schools is because a lot of these theories in the classical schools had problems. The primary problem with the Weberian approach, as we all know, is it was dehumanizing. It really didn't place a lot of value on those individual career administrators who were working in the organization. It was all about achieving the goal of the organization, being effective as an organization, as opposed to individuals being able to achieve their goals and develop as human resources. So it was a very sterile, very dehumanizing type of an approach. And it was also a very simplistic approach that didn't take into account any of the social dynamics that really go on within organizations. But the primary goal, which makes it a classical theory, is this focus on achieving the goals of the organization, very much this macro as opposed to a micro level way of studying an organization, as we had talked about last week. Last week, we talked about the different ways to study organizations, a macro approach, micro level approach, a management level approach. This is clearly more the macro organizational level approach to studying an organization. So that's Max Weber writing primarily in the very late 1800s and the very early 1900s. He died at a pretty young age. I think he was 54 when he died. So when he was really doing his writing was the very early 1900s. Then in the early 19 teens and 1920s, we had the advent of a second classical theorist, and that was our good friend Frederick Taylor. You probably remember some of Frederick Taylor from reading work about him in the 500 class. But you know, Frederick Taylor is closely associated with his theory of scientific management. Taylor, writing in the 1920s and the early 1900s, was writing at a time of a lot of labor unrest. And I'm sure you probably either in your undergraduate studies or even in high school, you read works such as Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which really documented a lot of the turmoil and a lot of the problems that were going on in corporations and industries and factories at the time. We had a lot of labor unrest. We had people who were being killed in our factories. We had run-ins between employees who were unhappy with their working conditions and police. So a lot of that labor unrest was something that Taylor wanted to try and address with a scientific study of how we could better manage our organizations. We also at that time did not really have the system of middle management that we see in most of our modern day organizations. There was very much a chasm between leaders at the top of the organization and then line employees at the bottom of the organization. We really didn't have much to really bridge that gap, any real connective tissue between leaders and workers. Because you didn't have a level of middle management, you had very little supervision and very little guidance for employees to go by. When employees didn't have a lot of supervision and a lot of guidance, those employees would basically do whatever they needed to do to get by on a daily basis. So they would just barely do enough so they wouldn't get in trouble. And it wouldn't be obvious that they weren't working as productively as they should be working. That was a process that Frederick Taylor referred to as soldiering. Soldiering was the process of just getting along, just doing as little as you could to get along daily. He wanted his new science of management to try and eliminate this soldiering process so that people could become more productive. The more productive employees are, obviously, the more efficient and more effective the organization will be. He also wanted to create a science of management so that we could identify the standards for selecting the quote unquote right person for a job, a way in which we could find the people who had the right set of skills and abilities to be able to do the job in an efficient, effective, and productive manner. He wanted in his science of management to systematize the tools that were used in production and systematize the entire production process. The ultimate goal of Taylor's scientific management was to discover the one best way to do a job. So for Frederick Taylor, the mechanism he used for that were those time motion studies. So in a time motion study, you would literally time the amount of time it would take someone to do a job. So you would stand behind them with a stopwatch like a productivity manager would do today. You would time every single motion they took. You would then try and eliminate what they called the false motions, the motions that did not contribute to doing the job in an efficient way, and then collect together what he called the true motions. Every motion that was contributing to productivity and the efficiency of getting the job done. You would then collect all those productive, those efficient motions together, and that would then constitute the one best way to do the job. You would then teach your employees the one best way to do the job, and you would then monitor their performance. And the ones who were then monitoring their performance would be this new cadre of management known as the middle managers, what we would call middle managers today. So they would actually measure the performance of these employees, make sure they're still doing the job in that one best way. Those employees that are doing the job in the one best way, they would then receive additional compensation. So there was pay for performance for doing the job the way in which you were supposed to do the job. If, however, the other end of the spectrum, someone was not doing the job in the one best way and not being productive and efficient, you don't train them up, you don't offer them professional development, you simply remove them from the organization. Taylor referred to people as being boorish beasts. He referred to employees as being merely cogs within the machinery. So if there is a cog in the machine that is broken, you throw away the broken cog and you replace it with a new cog, and the machinery then operates efficiently and productively again. In order for these bosses, for these middle managers, to be able to hold people accountable for doing the job in the one best way, those managers would also have to have task specialization. They would also have to know what the one best way to do the job is. So you would not only train your people who are doing the job, you would also train your middle managers so they can identify productive performance, identify unproductive performance, and then take the required action, either providing additional compensation or removing that person, firing them from the organization. So the focus here is really on the work that's being done and the process of work that's being done. And so if we could take this scientific approach to deconstruct each one of the jobs in our organization, identify the one best way to do each one of those jobs, hire people based upon having the skills to do the job in the one best way, train them up in how to do the job in the one best way, manage their performance in the one best way. That's how you would then make for an efficient and productive organization. So again, the focus here of scientific management in these time motion studies was very much a focus on what is in the best interest of the organization. So even though we are looking at work processes and we're looking at how the work's being done on a daily basis, we are still doing it for the purpose of the betterment of the organization, to make the organization as efficient as it can possibly be. So it's still, at the end of the day, had that macro level approach to how we make our organizations effective and efficient. But it was very dehumanizing, even more so than Max Weber. I mean, anytime you call someone a boorish beast or a cog in machinery, you are certainly dehumanizing that individual. It really very much overlooked all these social aspects and the social dynamics that went on within these organizations. But all those criticisms being said, scientific management really took the private sector by wildfire. It was spreading like wildfire throughout the 1920s. All these private sector organizations were buying into scientific management and implementing them within the organizations. So much so that public organizations started looking at these private organizations and saying, well, maybe we can do the same thing. So scientific management then started to bleed over into the public sector. Now, Frederick Taylor was not a public administration theorist, not by far. His focus was on the private sector. His focus was on doing this for private sector organizations in the business world. But this again started to cross over the line into the public sector. And we saw a lot of public sector organizations, especially at the federal level, starting to adopt scientific management. Now, clearly, you can see why it is in the classical school, because here again, we have a panacea. Here we have a one-size-fits-all approach. If we can come up with the one best way to do the job, the one singular way to do the job, and then make sure everyone does the job in that one best way, that's how we make our organizations efficient and effective. It did not take into account a lot of the contingencies and the contextual factors that modern organization theorists would tell us we have to consider. So Frederick Taylor and his scientific management, in terms of the models of organizational effectiveness, are somewhat similar to what we saw with Max Weber in his ideal bureaucracy. There is certainly a rational goal model in that the goal of the organization is what is important, and that goal is productivity. That goal is achieving the goal of the organization, which is to be effective and to get the work done in an effective and efficient manner. So very much a rational goal type of model. And then clearly an internal process model, because that's really the primary focus here, is the work that's being done within the organization on a daily basis. So as classical theorists, they share those same two models of organizational effectiveness. Now, in terms of Mintzberg's mechanisms for control and coordination, obviously standardization is very big here. Wants to try and standardize the process of work, and that's really the very heart of scientific management. Also wants to standardize the outputs of work, and that's what Tompkins tells us. Those are two of the primary mechanisms. Now, I told you when we talked about the Tompkins textbook last week, I think I mentioned to you that at times I like the Tompkins textbook. I really like this approach that he uses, but at times I will part company with his interpretation. And here is one of those times that I part company with his interpretation. I would also, if it was me, would also highlight the standardization of worker skills, because that was a very important part of scientific management, that we would need to try and hire the employees with the right set of skills in order to be able to do the job in that one best way. I think one of the reasons why Tompkins does not highlight standardization of worker skills is because there was not a whole lot of training going on with employees outside of just, this is how you do the job. So there wasn't a lot of professional development, training development outside of just, this is what you need to do and this is how you need to do it. But there was a recognition that if we did not hire people who had the requisite skills, we would not be able to do those jobs in the one best way. Then in terms of the four motivational strategies, the two that are really emphasized here with scientific management, the first one is, again, legal compliance. Here's the one best way. If you don't do it in the one best way, we will take you out of the organization. We will fire you and end your career with the organization. The second one, reward for performance. As we said, there was pay for performance. So if you are doing the job effectively and efficiently and doing it in the one best way, you will get remuneration. You will get compensation for that. So there was a lot of pay for performance emphasized with scientific management. So the similarities between Weber and Taylor and why they're in the classical school, primarily the focus on the organization, the macro level, and the focus on the one size fits all approach, the one panacea, the one cure all for how to make our organizations effective and efficient. But there are differences between Weber and Taylor as well. Weber focused much more on the structure of the organization with his tall hierarchy, a span of control, and unity of command, whereas Taylor focused more on the work processes, the jobs that were being done within the organization. But because they are so similar in their macro level focus, and they have this dehumanizing approach to individuals, we do kind of put them together in this classical school of organization theory. Then another author that I like to include in the classical school, and I think Tompkins would probably include them in administrative management approach, but I do put them in the classical school, is a theorist by the name of Henri Fayolle. And Henri Fayolle, I think we covered him very briefly in 500, but I like to spend a little bit more time on Fayolle because I think that there are some redeeming qualities. Even though he is a classical organization theorist, there are some redeeming qualities to his theories. Fayolle starts to expand our understanding of organizations a little bit by going a little bit beyond management. Clearly, Frederick Taylor was focused on management, whereas Weber was looking at structure. There was still a very management component to the way in which you structure your organization. Fayolle argues to us that management is important, but management is just one aspect of the overall governance of an organization. So what sets Fayolle a little bit apart from Weber and Taylor is he was interested in how do we govern an organization. Focusing on how we govern an organization is a theme that we will pick up on Wednesday when we move into our discussion of neoclassical theories like human relations and human resource management. So Fayolle looks at it as we need to know how to govern our organization, and management is just one of those activities we engage in when we govern our organization. So beyond just managing our employees, we also, in governing our organization, engage in technical activities. And he viewed technical activities as the actual creation of the goods and services by the organization. So basically, what we are producing and how we are producing it on a daily basis, those are our technical activities. So what types of technologies are we applying in order to create these goods and these services on a daily basis? We have to govern those types of technical activities. We also have to govern what he calls commercial activities. Organizations enter into transactions with other organizations and individuals all the time. So those transactions you engage in with organizations and individuals are what he calls your commercial activities. So these goods and these services that you are creating are ostensibly going to be consumed by individuals and groups in your external environment. You are going to enter into a transactional relationship, which is a commercial relationship with those individuals and those groups. So we have to learn how to govern those commercial activities. Organizations also engage in financial activities. So they have to generate revenue, whether that revenue comes from straight line appropriations from legislative bodies, whether that revenue comes from grants from foundations or wherever those grants are coming from. Those are financial activities that will contribute to the effectiveness of the organization. We need to govern those financial activities. We have to govern security activities. And by security activities, he means every organization must work to make sure that its employees are safe from harm. It has to protect its intellectual properties. It has to, at least today, not in Fayolle's time, but today, organizations are going to have to protect itself from cyber threats. And so cybersecurity would be one of those modern day security activities that we have to engage in governing when we govern an organization. And then accounting activities. We have to account for the resources we are consuming in producing our goods and our services. And we all know here in the public sector, we have some very stringent accounting requirements that we have to adhere to. We'll have audits. Sometimes we'll have annual audits. Sometimes we'll have audits twice per year. Sometimes we'll have to do legal financial audits. Sometimes we will have to do performance management audits. Sometimes we'll have to have audits conducted by outside auditors as compared to doing internal audits. Those audits sometimes have to be reviewed by external bodies. In my school district, all the bond money that was being spent had to be audited by an external auditor, and those audits then had to be approved by the Citizen Oversight Committee, and then the Citizens Oversight Committee approval would then come to the Board of Trustees, and the Board of Trustees would then have to approve the Citizens Oversight Committee approval of that audit. And so those are some of the accounting activities that we are really held accountable for in the public sector. But all these activities have to be managed within the overall governance of the organization. So how you manage all these activities will depend upon the type of activity that you are trying to manage within the governance of the organization. So how you manage your finances and the approaches you use to manage your finances may be different than the approaches used to provide for the security and safety of your intellectual property or the technical work that's being done on a daily basis. So the important thing about Fail is that he parts company a little bit from Weber and Taylor in that his governance and management theory is a bit more nuanced and a bit more complex. So it's not really always that same one-size-fits-all simplistic approach to running an organization. There's a bit more complexity that's involved with Fail's approaches. Fail argued that in managing all these different activities of the organization, that there were 5 essential functions that all managers will engage in. Functions such as planning, organizing, commanding, coordinating, and controlling. So these are the 5 basic functions of management. So if we are going to study an organization, one of the most effective ways to study that organization is to study how managers engage in these 5 essential functions. So how do they plan the operations of our organization? There are a lot of courses and MPA programs that are offered on strategic planning and strategic management. And whenever I've taught classes in strategic management, one of the primary tasks that we have done as a class is we have actually looked at the development of these strategic plans and the role of leaders and managers in developing these strategic plans. How do we identify the issues that are facing the organization? How do we identify the mandates, the things that we are required to do as an organization? And then based upon those issues we are facing and the mandates that are placed upon us, we take that information and we create a mission statement. And we're all very familiar with mission statements. A mission statement basically tells you what the organization is, why the organization exists, what the organization does. And so we develop those mission statements. We develop a vision statement. That vision statement is basically, how do we envision success? How do we know if our organization is being successful? Sometimes looked at as what are we trying to be when we grow up as an organization? So we take those issues, we take those mandates to create our mission and our vision. Then based upon the mission and the vision, we then engage in strategic planning. And in that strategic planning process, we will identify our goals, our long-term goals that we are trying to achieve, and then objectives, specific, measurable, empirical ways that we can go about achieving those goals. That type of strategic planning is an essential function of all leadership and management in every organization. So we can go and study how that strategic planning occurs. And studying how that strategic planning occurs That is obviously something that we do when we study those organizations. And that's why it's oftentimes, if not a required course in an MPA program, at least an elective course. Organizing is a second essential function of management. All leaders and managers need to organize the people within their organization, organize the structure of the organization so everyone kind of knows how they relate to each other. That's an essential function of management. The third essential function of management is commanding. We have to tell people what they are doing, make sure that everyone knows what they're doing, how they're supposed to do it, hopefully why they're supposed to do it, and when they're supposed to do it. So kind of that commanding type of function. Fourth function is coordination. We have very large organizations, and the tendency in bureaucracies is as bureaucracies get older, they tend to become larger. They tend to develop more rules and regulations. They tend to become more disaggregated in that they create more units and departments and divisions and kind of become a little bit more balkanized and more fractured in nature. And so the more balkanized your organization is, the more essential it is that you can engage in this coordination function, that you can really show how all the different disparate positions and disparate activities in the organization all then work together to help the organization achieve its overall goals that were identified back in the planning function. And then number 5, the controlling function. Controlling people and resources and money within the organization is an essential function of management. So Fayol argues to us, if we want to do a good job of studying an organization, we need to do a good job of studying those 5 essential functions that managers engage in. In studying those 5 essential functions, it really led Henri Fayol to the development of what he called his principles of management. And according to Fayol, for an organization to be effective and efficient, we need to focus on these discrete principles of management. And this is really the beginning of what came to be known as the principle school that we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute with Luther Gulick. But this is kind of the antecedents of this principle school that Luther Gulick became so famous for. So for Fayol, some of the principles of management are things like a division of work, very much like Max Weber. The principle that authority creates responsibility. If you provide people with authority over a task or over a certain type of outcome, they will then feel accountable and responsible for that task or that outcome. So if you want them to be responsible for their actions, you must allow them to develop authority over what they are doing. Now that's an interesting departure from Weber and Taylor. That's something Weber and Taylor really didn't talk much about in their classical theories. The third principle is discipline, very much in line with Weber and Taylor, that you have to have some disciplinary structures in place in order to get people to do what they're supposed to do. Unity of command, that is absolutely 100% one of the principles in Weber's ideal bureaucracy. The principle of subordination to the general interest, that people who are working in these organizations should subordinate their individual interests to the general interest of the organization itself. So what's in the good of the organization and the many is more important than what's in the good of the one. I know I butchered, if you're a Star Trek fan, I really butchered the Spock famous quote, but you kind of get the idea. Remuneration, that when people do a good job and do a productive job, they should get remuneration for their efforts. Centralization, very much like an ideal bureaucracy in Weber. A chain of command, just like an ideal bureaucracy of Weber. Order, like we saw in Weber and Taylor. Equity. Now, equity is an interesting one because an emphasis on equity is something we didn't see as much necessarily in Taylor. We did see pay for performance, and that compensation should be tied to the level of performance that someone is accomplishing. And so there's kind of an equitable component there. We also know that in Weber, The use of written rules and regulations was meant to protect individual rights and treat people more equitably because everyone will be held accountable to the same rules and the same regulations. So we did see some vestiges of equity in Weber and Taylor, but much more of an emphasis on treating people in an equitable manner as a principle of effective management with fail. Stability of personnel, again, harkens right back to Weber and his career administrators. Initiative. So fostering initiative among our employees. This is a bit of departure from what we saw with Weber and especially from Taylor. Taylor had that one best way to do the job. People do that job in the one best way. They really do not depart from that one best way. Here you want to foster innovation. So you want people to feel that they will not necessarily be penalized if they try something a little bit creative and a little bit more innovative. So that's a little departure from Weber and Taylor. And then the creating of an esprit de corps. And by esprit de corps, he basically means a feeling of teamwork, that everyone belongs in this organization, that everyone is committed to each other, that kind of we are all in this together as an organization. That esprit de corps starts to get us a little bit more down the road toward recognizing some of the social aspects of an organization. So I think this final principle of management really does foreshadow some of the arguments of neoclassical theorists such as Mary Parker Follett and Elton Mayo and Douglas McGregor, Chris Argyris, and others. So with fail, we see a lot of similarities to Weber and Taylor, but we do start to see a little bit of a breaking away, a little bit of a departure. So he's established, here are the 5 functions. And then he's established, here are the principles that these managers need to adhere to in order to make their organizations effective and efficient. He then broaches the issue of how then do effective managers implement these discrete principles of management. Well, first he says managers must know their organizations. They must know what is going on within their organizations. So he said the first step to implementing these principles is to survey the organization. Understand what the organization is doing on a daily basis, understand the challenges of the organization, understand the opportunities the organization faces. Very similar to what in modern day management we refer to as a SWOT analysis, an analysis of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and challenges. If you've ever engaged in a SWOT analysis, you know that the SW of SWOT, the strengths and the weaknesses, focus primarily internal to the organization. So what are some of the strengths we have as an organization? What are some of the weaknesses that we have as an organization? So our strengths could be things such as the quality of our personnel, could be the amount of resources that we have, could be the relationships that we have with our beneficiaries, with our citizens. Those are some of the major strengths. Maybe a reputation, a strong reputation of our organization could be another strength of our organization. And then what weaknesses do we have? And we tend to try and be as honest as we can about the weaknesses in our organization. So weaknesses such as we may have a high level of employee turnover. We're in trouble with employee retention, which is true post-COVID for a vast majority of public entities. There are a lot of public employees who worked remotely during COVID, and then when the call came to go back to the office, they said, no, I kind of like being at home. And so they decided they were going to retire from public service. So we have a lot of vacancies. That's a weakness of our organization. Maybe we have a lot of conflict in our organization between employees, between units, between divisions. So you need to understand and be honest about the strengths and the weaknesses. That's part of surveying your current situation. Then the OC of a SWOT, or if you like SWOT better, the OT, depends upon what you prefer, the opportunities and challenges, or the opportunities and threats. Those are usually external to the organization. So what are some of the opportunities in the external environment that the organization can leverage in order to improve its productivity? So maybe an opportunity could be there is a change in administration, and this new administration has as one of its policy priorities the policies and the programs that you are implementing as an organization. Well, that may provide you with the opportunity for a lot more visibility and the opportunity for a lot more in terms of appropriations. So that's an opportunity you would want to highlight. Maybe there are new technologies that are being developed that you can utilize as an organization. Maybe you have the opportunity to bring in generative AI and use that in certain limited aspects of doing your daily work. That's an environmental opportunity. And what challenges and threats are there? Maybe there's the creation of more organizations you have to compete with and contend with. Deregulation. We saw a lot of deregulation in the 70s as well as in the Reagan administration, a little bit less so in the Bush administrations, but a lot of deregulation. Deregulation could end up introducing a lot more competition. So you're no longer in a monopoly. Now you're in a competitive environment. That's going to introduce a lot of threats and challenges to your organization. So today we would do a SWOT analysis, but back in Fail's time, you refer to it as surveying your situation as an organization. Once you've identified your current situation, and today those strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and challenges, then your next step would be engage in this planning, and you plan what you're going to do in your organization, how you're going to address those issues, how you're going to address those strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and challenges. You report. You then report on how well you are addressing all those strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and challenges, and you write down those results in written documentation. And those are kind of the steps that he says we would go through in terms of implementing those principles that we had looked at on the previous screen. Hopefully, we will have an organization chart in place that will document everyone's responsibilities and all the activities that everyone engages in so that we will know who is doing what in order to be able to actually implement these plans that we create to then implement those principles. So let's unrefail. Fail focused very much on those psychological factors. If you go back and look at some of these principles, a lot of them have some psychological elements. Authority creates responsibility. The impact of discipline on individuals. The fostering of initiative. The fostering of equity. The subordination to the general interest. The creation of an esprit de corps. All these have psychological elements to them. And Fail really focused on the psychological ways in which we could create principles and then adhere to these principles of effective management. Fail's student, who is Mooney, kind of shared a similar approach to Fail, but Mooney focused more on organization structure, whereas Fail focused more on psychological factors. But what Fail and Mooney both shared is this idea that we could create principles of effective management and then teach these principles to our managers, and then that is what will eventually make our organizations effective and efficient. For Mooney, instead of having all those principles we looked at with Fail, he really truncated that list down to 3 primary principles of any organization. The first one is the coordinative principle. Just like what Fail said, we need to coordinate the activities and the actions within our organization. The scalar chain principle, just like Fail told us, as well as Weber told us. But again, these are structural types of approaches. A scalar chain, unity of command, that's a very structural approach. But what Mooney is best known for in public organization theory is his third principle of organizations, which is the functional theory, the functional principle. The functional principle looks at the functions of individual employees, saying that as we control and as we coordinate the activities of these individual employees, we need to understand that different employees have different types of functions. So perhaps we need to manage these employees differently depending upon what their essential functions are. And so when you compare the functions of employees in an organization, it resulted in kind of this dichotomous categorization of employees. On one side, you have what are called line employees. And then on the other side, you have staff employees. Line employees are going to be your employees who oftentimes are actually delivering the goods and the services to beneficiaries. So these line employees are kind of what Michael Lipsky refers to as your street level bureaucrats. So these are the ones who are on the street level. These are the ones who are actually going out there and interfacing directly with citizens, consumers, clients, members of the public, however you want to term those individuals. Those are the people who are interfacing directly with those consumers. Those are your line employees. Then you have your staff employees. Staff employees are the ones who provide the resources to make the work of the line employees possible. So whatever resources are needed to help the line employees do their job, to interface with citizens, those resources are the ones that are managed and provided by those staff employees. So if you have line employees who are going out there in the community to hold information sessions, well, they're going to have to get there. And so, maintaining the fleet of agency vehicles, that's going to be a responsibility of a staff employee. Reimbursing, if they're using their private vehicles, reimbursing those line employees for their gas and their mileage. Those types of administrative tasks are going to fall onto those staff employees. Doing the correspondence and sending out the mailers and all that information, that's going to come from those staff employees. So this is an important contribution that Mooney makes to our understanding of organizations, in that not every position is managed in the exact same way. We have to know what those positions do, the functions of those positions, and then manage those positions accordingly. So there is not necessarily a one-size-fits-all way in which we will manage those positions. So this adds a little bit more context and a little bit more nuance than what we had originally seen with other classical theorists such as Weber and Taylor. He still kind of has that one-size-fits-all approach, because he's saying here are the three principles we need to adhere to, but how we apply those principles will differ depending upon which type of employee we are dealing with. So not all employees are necessarily equal in terms of what they do and how they should be managed. So I think that, some people will talk about Fail and Mooney as part of a principal administrative management type of school. I tend to cobble them together with Weber and Taylor in the classical school, because the ultimate goal of both Fail and Mooney is still a goal on coming up with these principles, coming up with these kind of universal ways of dealing with our organizations for the same purpose as Weber and Taylor. And that same purpose is to make our organizations as effective and efficient as possible. So the goal of all of these classical theorists is still the organization as opposed to the individual employee. But with all these classical theorists up to this point in time, Weber and Taylor and Fail and Mooney, their writings were not necessarily devoted to the public sector. They were not writing primarily with public organizations in mind. However, our next classical theorist, who's also within this principles approach, Luther Gulick, is far more in alignment with public organizations. And Gulick is best known for his own iteration of the principles approach to management. Gulick is very much aligned with the public sector because he studied public organizations, and so much so that Luther Gulick served on the Brownlow Commission. And I think we may mention this in 500, but just as a refresher, we're all familiar with the Great Depression. And we know after the Great Depression, FDR comes into the White House, had to deal with all the throes of the Great Depression. So the way in which he did it was through his New Deal policies and programs. So he created all these different programs. He created all what were called alphabet agencies, all these new federal agencies that were meant to carry out these programs. Now, these programs, these agencies, we say created by FDR, but they were proposed to Congress, they were approved by Congress, they were appropriated by Congress, and then went into existence. In the very early years of the New Deal, a lot of these New Deal programs were challenged in the courts. And initially, the Supreme Court actually did not side with the FDR administration. The courts actually sided with the challengers, with the plaintiffs in those cases, and felt that this was an extension, too much of an extension of federal authority. FDR obviously did not like that. And so this is where the famous court packing threat came from. So FDR, in order to try and induce compliance on the part of the Supreme Court, he threatened the Supreme Court with court packing. And I'm mentioning all this because it should almost sound vaguely familiar to what's been going on over the past several years. In the Biden administration, there is a lot of discussion from Democrats about packing the court, increasing the number of justices on the Supreme Court from 9 to 15 in order to try and change the decisions of the court. And so this is what FDR proposed to do. I'll just pack the court. And so I will appoint more justices to the court, and I'll appoint justices who will then support my New Deal programs. But there's no direct empirical evidence that his threat of court packing really resulted in the court changing its direction on the New Deal. But I don't think it's just simple covariation that it happened. But after the court packing threat, suddenly the Supreme Court started supporting the constitutionality of some of these agencies and some of these programs that were being created under the New Deal. So then the Supreme Court started supporting them, and then they started creating, and then the administration started proposing more agencies and more programs. The more agencies and programs you have created to deal with the Great Depression, the larger and larger the federal bureaucracy becomes. The federal bureaucracy just exploded exponentially in the 1930s, so much so that it became almost impossible for the president to manage this ever-increasing federal bureaucracy. So we had the creation of the Brownlow Commission, and the Brownlow Commission was there to try and reorganize the federal bureaucracy to make it a little bit easier for the president to manage. So through the Brownlow Commission, we ended up getting some high-profile changes, such as the creation of this umbrella organization known as the Executive Office of the Presidency. The Executive Office of the Presidency, which still exists today, is an umbrella agency in which we place all these management overhead agencies within the executive office to give them closer proximity to the president in the White House. So the president, to manage financial aspects of all these federal departments and federal agencies, can go through what is now known as the Office of Management and Budget. Back then it was known as the Bureau of the Budget prior to 1970. Now it's the Office of Management and Budget. Office of Management and Budget is housed within the Executive Office of the President. The creation of a White House office to provide administrative support to the President in managing the federal bureaucracy. The White House office is located within the Executive Office of the President. But also the Brownlow Commission, in addition to that, made many recommendations for how to better manage these organizations. And it provided Luther Gulick as the chair of the Brownlow Commission to be able to bring his theories to bear on the federal bureaucracy. So Luther Gulick really is the first public administration theorist here who actually developed organization theories based upon the public sector and then had the opportunity, the venue, to apply them directly into the public sector at the federal level. So that's why we kind of look at Luther Gulick as kind of being our first real organization theorist for public organizations. Gulick, like Vail and Mooney, believed that there were certain discrete universal principles of good, effective management. And if we could identify those principles and teach those principles to our managers, that's how we can make effective managers and in turn then make effective organizations. So according to Gulick, the principles of management we should develop are the principles of planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. You've heard about these principles before in your time in the MPA program. You're probably familiar with the acronym POSCORB, P-O-S-D-C-R-B, which stands for the planning, organizing, staffing, coordinating, reporting, and directing. So if we could teach our managers how to plan, a la Henri Vail, we can make them effective managers. They need to know how to survey their situations and come up with action plans to then deal with those strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and challenges. Not that that was called that at that time, but it is today. They need to know how to organize their institutions, know how to organize their resources. They need to know how to staff their organizations, get the right personnel with the right skill sets into the right positions. They need to know how to direct those employees. Granted, some of our classical theorists refer to that as controlling them. Gulick refers to that as directing them in terms of what they should do and how they should do it on a daily basis. They need to have the skills of coordination, just like we saw with Mayo and we saw with Mooney. They have to have the ability to report, much like how Fail told us we need to implement his principles. And they need to have budgeting skills. They need to know how to generate revenue. They need to know how to utilize that revenue. They need to know how to account for that revenue. So planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting are the essential managerial principles that every manager needs to know how to do. Luther Gulick felt that all of these principles were essentially managerial tools in a managerial toolkit. And so if we can put all these tools into the toolkit, provide that managerial toolkit to our managers, then our managers will then be able to, whenever they need to, pull out the appropriate tool. So if you're working on a sink, you're not going to probably pull out a flathead screwdriver, you're probably going to pull out a pipe wrench. You need to know what tool to pull out in a given situation. But if we could teach all these tools to our managers, that's how we make effective managers. And if we make effective managers, ergo, we are then going to make effective organizations. So I take the principal theorists, Fail, Mooney, and Gulick, and put them in the classical school because they still kind of share that approach of we are focusing on the macro level of what is in the best interest of the organization. And if we can develop these principles, if we can develop the one best way to do the job, if we can develop the ideal structure, then that is what will make our organizations, all of our organizations, every organization, effective and efficient. So taken together, Gulick, Fail, and Mooney, these kind of principle-oriented theorists, what models of organizational effectiveness do they tend to favor? Just like the other classical theorists, Weber and Taylor, they tend to favor a rational goal approach as well as an internal process approach. The goal is making organizations efficient and effective, making them productive. The internal process, obviously, all of this is going on inside our organization. All these principles are being applied within the organization by our managers. In Mintzberg's mechanisms for coordination and control, there is still a lot of direct supervision. There's a lot of directing, a lot of organizing. Now, granted, Fail does have some initiative built in there. Fail does have some authority creates responsibility. He does have some psychological elements built in, but it is still very much direct supervision as compared to a lot of the neoclassical theorists that we will talk about on Wednesday. And then finally, in terms of motivational strategies, the primary motivational strategy is still going to be legal compliance, holding people accountable to doing the job efficiently and effectively, holding people accountable to adhering to the rules and the regulations. And so because they share all the same models of organizational effectiveness, same mechanisms for control, as well as the same motivational strategies, I think it's just more efficient for us, no pun intended, to kind of put all of them together into this classical school of organization theory. Now, from a chronological perspective, these classical theorists that we've recapped tonight, they run from the very late 1800s primarily into the 1930s and into the early 1940s. And that was kind of when this classical school of organization theory was really very much at its heyday. Now, we know that there are criticisms of the Weber school, Weber theories, or criticisms of Taylor's theory. So what are some of the criticisms of Fail, Mooney, and Gulick, these principles types of authors? Well, two very famous public administration theorists offered up some pretty damning criticisms of the principles approach to organization theory. The first one is our good friend Herb Simon. And Herbert Simon gets mentioned in public administration in a lot of different contexts because Herbert Simon was a very prolific writer, but most of Simon's writings were writings critiquing other people's theories. Now, granted, he did develop some of his own theories, the theory of cognitive limitations and bounded rationality and things like that. But he was very good at critiquing other people's theories. And some academics make a very good career out of not really developing new theories, but critiquing existing theories. Simon's critique of the principal school was a critique that these are not really scientific principles as much as they are proverbs. And he referred to the principal school derisively as the proverb school. So when you think about a proverb is a story. And for any story, for any proverb, you can always find or develop a countervailing proverb or story. So he said for any one of these principles, you can find a counter principle that kind of cancels it out. So as you're doing one principle, it is oftentimes mutually exclusive to another principle. So by doing one principle, you're not able to do another principle. So sometimes the principles run counter to each other. Dwight Waldo, another very famous public administration theorist, referred to these principles as prescriptions. He said, like Simon said, that these principles are not scientific maxims. These are not scientific types of things. But instead, these principles are very value laden, that these principles are developed with a goal in mind. And the goal in mind is to emphasize the ability of managers and leaders to control the behavior of employees and to centralize the operations of organizations. So Waldo basically argues that the principles theorists, Fail, Mooney, and Gulick, they developed these principles for a purpose. And the purpose was centralization, to take decision-making authority away from lower-level employees and to concentrate the locus of decision-making at the upper level of our organization in a very regimented, very classical type of way, and made the argument that there wasn't a whole lot of justification for this type of social control over employees within organizations. So basically, you take Simon as well as Waldo's criticisms, you combine them together, and you're hearing a very similar theme that what you heard with the criticisms for Max Weber and Frederick Taylor, in that they tend to be relatively dehumanizing and they tend to take away a lot of autonomy and self-determination and self-control away from the individual employees within organizations. That type of criticism, that we tend to dehumanize employees, we tend to take away a lot of the social dynamics of the organization. Those are the primary criticisms that then gave rise to new theories and a new school of thought in the neoclassical theories. And that's what kind of gave rise then to that school of human relations and the school of human resource management, these new kind of neoclassical approaches that were all developed to try and deal with some of these flaws or perceived flaws within the classical school. So that's about a 90-minute discussion of the initial evolution of public organization theory. Again, about 50 years of public administration organization theory running from the very late 1800s up until the early 1940s. So at this point, I know I've talked a lot up to this point in the class, but do you have any questions, observations, any clarifications needed on any of this information we've covered on classic school of thought up to this point in time? Then what I would propose is we are bumping up against 7:30, so I think it is high time to take an evening break. So let's take our break. Let's say we'll come back at 7:40, and then we come back at 7:40. I know there are only 11 of us here tonight, but I still think that's enough for us to break up into two groups. So we come back at 7:40, we'll break up into two groups, and then we'll do this breakout exercise very quickly. We won't spend a whole lot of time on it tonight, maybe about half an hour or so. We'll break up in our groups, see what each group came up with, reconvene, and then see what the similarities and differences are in the responses from the group. So take a break to 7:40, come back, and we will do our breakout groups.